what if the house you live in never stops watching you? In this chilling adaptation of Eyes in the Wall, Mắt Người Trong Tường, discover the story of a builder who unearths something unspeakable behind plaster and brick, real human eyes embedded in the wall. As the whispers grow louder and the cracks spread deeper, one terrifying truth becomes clear. The house was never empty. If you enjoy atmospheric horror filled with creeping dread and mind-bending revelations, don't miss this haunting journey. The house on Langley Street had always stood apart, not because of grandeur or beauty, but because of how it seemed to breathe silence. Unlike its neighboring homes, whose windows flickered with warmth and life, this one sat cold and still, a structure forgotten by time. Its walls were faded gray, the paint peeling like old skin, and the narrow front porch creaked even without the weight of footsteps. For years, it remained uninhabited. Children whispered stories about it, daring each other to knock on the boarded-up door, claiming to hear soft thuds from within. Some said the house was cursed. Others believed it was merely sad. When Samuel Greaves, a 38-year-old builder with a sun-leathered face and hands tough as brick, took the job of restoring it, he dismissed the rumors. Wood rots, pipes groan, old houses make noise. That's it, he told the owner, a quiet man who had inherited the house from a distant aunt and wanted to renovate it for sale. On the first day of work, Samuel stepped through the narrow entrance, flashlight in hand. Dust spiraled through the air like ash. Disturbed by the groan of the front door swinging open, the floorboards whined beneath his boots. He swept the beam across the foyer. Aged wallpaper with faded florals, a tarnished mirror, and a narrow staircase that twisted upward like a spinal column. It was quiet. Too quiet. He paused, feeling the air settle around him. It wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was something else, a listening stillness. Shrugging it off, Samuel made his way toward the living room. His job was to gut one of the interior walls, an old partition separating the sitting room from the hallway. It was poorly done. Thin plaster and lath that likely covered structural flaws. The owner wanted it gone to open the space. Samuel worked alone. He preferred it that way. Fewer questions, fewer eyes. As he set down his tools and touched the wall, a strange sensation crept into his fingertips. The surface was warm, faintly pulsing like a fevered brow. He jerked his hand back, heart thudding. Probably just sunlight warming the bricks, he thought. Still, something gnawed at him. He brought the sledgehammer down hard. The wall shuddered with a low, groaning moan. Not the usual dry splintering of old wood. More like a deep exhale. He froze, his ears straining. Then a sound, not from the floor above, not from outside, from within the wall. He leaned closer, ear nearly pressed to the cool surface. The tapping stopped, replaced by a whisper, faint, unintelligible. It reminded him of someone murmuring just below the surface of a lake. He backed away, breath caught in his chest. His rational mind screamed that it was old piping, rats, or wind. But deep down, something darker stirred. The rest of the day passed uneasily. Every strike of the hammer echoed with unnatural weight. The air felt heavier in that room. Like the house itself was holding its breath. He could hear the soft crackling of plaster falling, the flutter of paint chips, and underneath it all, the whispering. By late afternoon, he had broken through the outer layer. A narrow gap formed, revealing the rough interior. Samuel shined his flashlight inside, expecting beams and insulation. Instead, something glossy reflected the light back. He squinted, leaning in closer. A circle. No, an orb. Wet, glimmering. It blinked. Samuel stumbled backward, crashing into a ladder. The clatter echoed through the hollow space. He gripped the edge of the wall and stared into the hole again. The orb was gone. No, it had simply turned away. He pressed a trembling hand to the plaster. There was something inside, behind the lath, embedded deep in the mortar. He couldn't stop. He had to see. Digging with claw, hammer, and fingers, Samuel pulled away more of the wall. Layers crumbled under his determination. Dust choked the air, and the smell changed. No longer stale wood and mildew. Now it was iron-rich, metallic, like blood in rain. His fingers touched something slick. He recoiled, wiping his hand on his jeans. A red smear followed. A low hum began. At first, he thought it was a pipe, but it resonated with a tremble in his chest. It wasn't mechanical. It was alive. Then came the sound of breathing. Not his, not from the hallway, from the wall. He turned, backing away, chest heaving. Then the room seemed darker now, though the sun still bled through the slatted blinds. Shadows stretched too far. The air was no longer silent. It murmured. He left his tools behind. Outside, he collapsed on the porch, hands shaking, heart thrumming against his ribs. He stared at the wall from the outside, where the bricks met the ground. Something was inside, watching. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He lay in his apartment, listening to every creak, every gust of wind. But what haunted him most wasn't the sound. It was the memory of that eye. It had not just looked at him. It had recognized him. When morning came, he considered not returning. But something pulled him back. A need to understand. A builder's curse, perhaps. Or maybe the house had chosen him. He arrived just after dawn. No birds sang on Langley Street. The grass around the house was still damp with dew, but the air was stifling. Inside, the scent of iron was stronger. He stepped back into the living room. The hole in the wall had grown. He hadn't done that, and this time there were more eyes. 6 of them, all open, all watching, all human. None of them blinked. The night air pressed heavy on Samuel's apartment windows, as if the darkness outside wanted to seep in and wrap around him. He had drawn the curtains, locked every door twice, and left the kitchen light on, but none of it helped. Sleep would not come. He lay in bed, fully clothed, the flickering shadows from a street lamp slicing across his ceiling. his ears strained to catch every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator, every whisper that might not be there. But it was the silence between the sounds that disturbed him most, that tight, breathless quiet, the kind that reminded him of the living room wall. The kind that listened. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he heard it, a soft scratching, not outside, not in the hallway, from the other side of his bedroom wall. He sat up, heart suddenly hammering. The scratching came again, slow, deliberate, like fingernails across wallpaper. Samuel held his breath. Then the whispering started. It was faint, too faint to catch words, but it was there, unmistakable, like voices murmuring through cotton, as if someone or something was trying to speak through the very walls of his home. He stood up slowly, bare feet cold against the wooden floor. He walked to the wall, pressed his palm against it. The whispering stopped. He jerked his hand away. Nothing. Silence. But now he couldn't stay. At dawn, before the sky had fully lightened, Samuel drove back to the house on Langley Street. The neighborhood was still asleep, the trees unmoving in the windless morning. He parked without shutting off the engine, staring at the old house through the windshield. It looked the same, as if yesterday hadn't happened, as if those eyes in the wall were just dreams conjured from exhaustion. But he knew they weren't. He killed the engine, stepped out, and approached the porch. The front door stood slightly ajar. He froze. He was sure he'd locked it when he fled. He remembered the click, the trembling in his hand as he turned the key. Now it yawned open like a mouth. He stepped inside, heart in his throat. The air was damp, thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something meaty. The hole in the living room wall was larger. No tools lay nearby. He had taken nothing with him when he ran. But someone or something had kept digging. The edges of the hole were raw, fresh. Plaster and dust still scattered the floor beneath it, and inside, the eyes were gone. He stepped closer. A chill slipped down his spine. The cavity was now a dark tunnel. Narrow but deep. Too deep for any normal wall. He shined his flashlight in. It reflected nothing. Only blackness. Then movement. He saw it, just barely. A flicker at the far end of the tunnel. A shimmer, like light glancing off a wet surface. He pulled back fast. That was no tunnel. That was a passage. Samuel swallowed hard, forcing down the rising bile in his throat. He wasn't here to play detective. He was supposed to tear down this wall, finish the renovation, get paid, and move on. But the eyes. He needed to understand. He retrieved his tools, gloves shaking on his hands. He began to widen the hole further. The wall came apart easier than expected, like the house wanted it gone. Each chunk he pulled away revealed more of the interior cavity, rough brick smeared with a dark, sticky residue. And then he found the first one. Not an eye, a socket. An empty hole in the mortar, round, smooth, and lined with flesh. He reeled back, bile finally rising to the surface. He turned and vomited onto the floorboards, the sound loud and obscene in the silence of the house. When he wiped his mouth, he heard something, a breath, Not his. Long, wet, wheezing. It came from behind the wall. He backed away, tools forgotten, heart racing. And then he heard the soft sound of laughter, high-pitched, childlike. It echoed from inside the passage. That night, Samuel didn't go home. He checked into a roadside motel, one of those cheap fluorescent-lit places where the sheets smell like bleach and time doesn't pass. Still, he couldn't sleep. He kept the TV on, volume low, flicking through channels that only offered static or late-night infomercials. But in the white noise of the screen, he sometimes heard the whispers again, late into the night, as the flickering light from the television bathed the room in sickly blue. He drifted into uneasy sleep. And he dreamed. He was standing in the living room again. The wall was sealed, untouched, but the room was breathing, walls pulsing with a slow rhythm. The floor groaned under invisible footsteps, and the whispering filled the air like a psalm. Then came the eyes, not just from the wall, but from the floor, the ceiling, the furniture, everywhere, watching, judging. The final thing he saw before waking was a face pressed against the wall from the inside, its skin fused with plaster. Lips stretched wide, mouthing words he couldn't hear. When he woke up, it was still dark, but he wasn't alone. A shadow stood at the end of the motel bed. He lunged for the lamp, turned it on. The room was empty, no sign of anyone, but the carpet, it was wet, as if something had stood there, watching, and wept. Morning came dull and lifeless, the sky above Langley Street choked in a smear of gray. The air held no breeze, no birdsong, only the muffled hum of silence pressing against rooftops like a suffocating blanket. Samuel stood in front of the house again, his motel key still in his pocket, untouched. He had not gone back to the apartment. He couldn't. Not with the whispering walls and the damp spot on the carpet that hadn't dried by dawn. His hands trembled as he unlocked the front door, stepping back into the decaying bones of the place that had begun to unravel his sense of reality. Inside, nothing had moved. At least, not visibly. But something was wrong. He didn't need to walk to the living room to know it. The wrongness hung in the air like a thick fog, prickling at the back of his neck. He could feel it watching, always watching. His boots creaked on the dusty floor as he made his way to the wall. The hole was sealed. He stopped. The passage he had torn open with sweat and grit, gone. In its place stood a smooth expanse of plaster, unbroken and clean. Too clean. It hadn't been rebuilt. It had healed. He touched the surface. It felt warm again, warmer than it should. He pressed harder, and that's when he saw it. A crack, hairline thin, barely visible, running from floor to ceiling in a slow, jagged line. It hadn't been there before. It trembled when he touched it. And then came the sound. A long, slow exhale from behind the wall. Wet and thick, like breath through fluid. Samuel stepped back, heart knocking against his ribs. The crack pulsed. Something moved beneath it. He turned sharply as the floor groaned behind him. No one, just dust, stillness. But when he looked back, the crack had widened. Just a fraction. Enough for something to slip through. Later, he didn't wait. He grabbed his toolbox and went to the kitchen, needing space, light, sanity. The kitchen was the least touched room. Yellow tiles, a chipped sink, and faded curtains hung like cobwebs over the back window. The air was heavy with age, but not menace. Until the faucet turned itself on. The squeal of rusted metal echoed through the room as a thin stream of brown water poured from the spout. Samuel stared at it, frozen. Then the drain began to gurgle. At first, it was just air, but then came the sound of something crawling. Not rats, not bugs, something heavier, thick, slow slithering. He backed away, knocking over a rusted chair. The water in the sink trembled as though something was rising through it. A finger emerged, long, bloated, skin blistered and gray. It curled slightly, then retreated back down the drain. Samuel ran. He didn't remember grabbing his keys, didn't remember the door slamming behind him. Only the cold wind slapping his face as he stumbled into the front yard, gasping for air. But Langley Street wasn't the same. Every house looked darker. Blinds were drawn, curtains still. The entire street was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't just the house anymore. The silence had spread. He drove without direction, hands slick on the wheel, eyes darting to the rear-view mirror every few seconds. No one followed. No one had to. The presence was inside him now. He ended up in a small diner outside of town, the kind with plastic booths and burnt coffee. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, offered him a weak smile. He didn't smile back. He ordered black coffee and stared into the swirling darkness of the cup, hoping for answers. Instead, he heard the whisper again, not from the walls, from the window beside him. He turned. A child stood outside, staring through the glass. Pale, unmoving, her eyes were wrong. Not wide-eyed with curiosity, wide, because they were sewn open. The thread was red, fresh, and she smiled. The whispering filled the room, only it wasn't in his ears anymore. It was in his head. He blinked and she was gone. The cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The waitress rushed over, kneeling beside the broken ceramic. "Are you okay?" she asked. But her voice sounded far away, because behind her, on the far wall of the diner, a hairline crack had begun to form, just like the one in the house, thin, pale, breathing. Samuel left without paying. He drove back to the house before nightfall. He knew what was happening now. The crack had followed him. He stood in front of the wall again. The plaster was still intact, but the crack, it was wider. And behind it, he could see something pressing against it, a shape, a face. No eyes this time, just skin, pale, soft, writhing. He reached for his hammer, not to dig, to seal it back. But the wall moved under his touch. The crack began to split wider on its own. The breath returned, and this time it spoke. "You're letting us out." The voice was many voices, layered, male and female, child and elder, speaking in harmony, in hunger. Samuel dropped the hammer. His fingers were bleeding. He hadn't even noticed. He stared at the crack as it began to split downward like a wound, red seeping from the edges. It wasn't just a passage. It was a birth canal, and something was coming through. He stepped back, but the house groaned. The floor beneath his boots flexed as if the wood itself had lungs. He turned to flee, but from the hallway he heard the creak of footsteps, slow, wet, and then softly, a whisper that sounded like his own voice, echoing back at him. Welcome home. Samuel did not remember running, only the sound of the door slamming behind him, only the hammering of his boots against the gravel drive, only the way the sky above Langley Street seemed to fold in on itself, as if the clouds were watching too. He drove. He didn't care where. His hands shook on the wheel. The road blurred beneath him, the hum of tires drowned by the echo in his mind. "You're letting us out!" Those words weren't just memory. They repeated over and over. Behind his eyes, in the creases of his skull, a voice like many voices, a choir of rot. He reached the edge of town before the nausea hit. He pulled over on the shoulder and vomited into the weeds, bile and fear spilling from his gut in dry heaves. When it was over, he leaned against the side of the truck, sweat chilling on his neck, the wind whispering through the tall grass like voices carried through 1,000 mouths. He couldn't go back to the motel. He couldn't go home. Somewhere along the winding back roads, he parked the truck and slept inside it, seat reclined, doors locked. Still, it found him. In his dreams, the wall breathed, the crack widened, the face behind it grew clearer. It had no skin, only blood-veined muscle, wet, glimmering. And the eyes were stitched shut, but they wept black fluid that stained the plaster like mold. When he woke, the windshield was fogged. On the inside, a single word had been drawn into the glass with a fingertip. Deeper. Samuel drove back just before dusk. The house welcomed him. It always did. No resistance. The door creaked open before he could even touch the handle. Inside, the silence had changed. It wasn't passive anymore. It hummed, like something was breathing, not just behind the walls, but within the house itself. He walked slowly toward the living room. The crack had spread. It ran along the ceiling now, curling like a vein across the plaster, pulsing ever so slightly. Faint lines stretched from it in all directions, like the beginnings of a web, as if the house was cracking apart from the inside. He approached the wall with a crowbar this time, not to open it, to dig behind it. He had to know, he had to see what lived there. He drove the edge of the bar into the plaster, gouging through the soft material like skin. The wall groaned. The sound was wet and organic, like tearing open flesh. He dug deeper. Behind the plaster wasn't wood. It wasn't brick. It was soft, and it bled. Samuel staggered back, panting. Red fluid leaked from the hole, thick and slow, like syrup from a wound. He dropped the crowbar. It clattered on the floor, echoing too long in the hollow space of the house. Then the whispering returned, louder now, bolder, less like suggestion and more like a call. Samuel. He froze. It knew his name. It hadn't whispered it before, not out loud. He backed away. His heel caught on the crowbar and he fell hard onto the floor. As he scrambled back to his feet, Something caught his eye, a shape, near the corner of the room, small, almost human. It stepped into the dim light. A child, no older than 7, pale skin, hair limp and dark. But the eyes, they were wrong. Too large, too open, and the pupils gone. Just milky orbs staring at nothing and everything. Samuel opened his mouth. No sound came. The child tilted its head, and a small hand lifted, pointing to the wall, behind the plaster. He didn't move. The child walked to the crack, placed its hand against it, and whispered something. The plaster rippled beneath its touch. Then the child turned its head slowly to look at him, lips parting. From its mouth spilled a sound that wasn't words, not language, just pain. A long guttural howl that rattled the windows and made Samuel's teeth ache. The floor quaked beneath him. The walls shuddered, and the plaster split. It peeled apart like skin, curling from the edges, revealing the thing beneath. Not structure, not foundation, a face. Huge, pressed into the wall like it had been entombed alive. Its eyes opened slowly, human, bloodshot, and wide. They fixed on Samuel. They blinked. They wept. He couldn't breathe. He ran, out the door, down the steps, onto the street. But the silence followed, not just from the house, from every home on the block. Windows stared like blank eyes. The trees stood too still. No wind, no birds, no sound. The whole world held its breath. Samuel dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Inside his skull, the voices roared. Deeper, deeper, deeper. He screamed, and the echo bounced back from the walls of every house around him. He wasn't alone, not anymore. The house had let something out, and it wasn't going back in. Samuel didn't know how long he stayed in the middle of the street. The sun had fallen. The world had dimmed into that gray hour between evening and night, when shadows stretch too far and nothing feels quite real. He sat on the pavement, arms wrapped around his knees, breath shallow, skin cooled despite the warm air. The silence never lifted. Not the silence from the house, not the silence from the street, and not the silence inside himself. Only one sound cut through, the soft, wet fluttering of eyelids. Except there was no blinking. He knew that sound now, had heard it more than once. It was the shifting of eyes, too swollen to close. Eyes ear-bedded in walls and floors and thoughts. They watched. Always. Eventually he stood. His legs trembled, his body hollow from fear and lack of sleep. But he had to go back. He had to see what the house truly was, and what it wanted from him. He passed the threshold again, barefoot now, shoes discarded somewhere down the block. The hardwood floor was cold and damp beneath him, as if the house had begun to sweat. The smell was stronger. Copper and mildew, old water, old wounds. The living room had changed. The crack in the wall had widened further, stretching down the full height like a wound gasping open. The plaster had peeled back into curling flaps, revealing not drywall, not brick, but something else. It was soft, pink, pulsing faintly, lined with tiny red vessels, like the interior of a mouth or worse. Something moved beneath it. Samuel stepped forward. He didn't call out. There was no one to answer. Only the watching, the waiting. Then he saw them. The eyes, dozens, no longer hidden, embedded directly into the wall, each socket swollen, wet with moisture. Each eye slightly bloodshot and twitching. They followed him. He moved left, they turned left. He stepped closer. The pupils dilated. None of them blinked. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He reached for the crowbar lying where he had dropped it before, and the whisper came again. "You see us now." He turned sharply. No one there. "You woke us." It was coming from behind the wall. No, through the wall. The voices echoed inside his bones. He raised the crowbar, not in defense, in fear, in fury. He swung it at the nearest eye. The metal struck the soft wall with a dull thunk. The eye burst. A scream erupted, not from his mouth. Not from the room, but from inside the house itself. The walls pulsed. The floor groaned. A low-frequency hum shook the windows. Blood oozed from the cracked wall. But the other eyes didn't close, didn't flinch. They stared harder. He backed away, crowbar slick with blood and fragments of jelly. He turned, fleeing into the hallway. But the walls were different now. Hairline cracks crawled along every surface, pulsing like veins. And on them, more eyes. In the kitchen, the bathroom, the staircase. They watched from ceiling corners, from the seams of the wallpaper, from the center of light bulbs, now long dead. The house had become a body, and Samuel was inside it. He stumbled into the basement, searching for space, for a place where the watching might stop. But it followed. In the dark, he heard it, wet breathing. Something alive, something awake. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam wavered, shaky in his grasp. It landed on a figure. Not a person. Not anymore. Its limbs were bent in wrong angles, bones warped, skin peeled back in long strips. And where its face should have been, only one thing. An enormous, lidless eye. It twitched, focused on him, and then the voice returned. "You gave us form." The thing took a step forward, knees cracking backward. "Now, we give you sight." Samuel turned to run, but collided with another wall, one that hadn't been there before. It was soft, warm, pulsing, and it opened, a single vertical slit lined with teeth, not for chewing, for seeing. He screamed. The scream filled the basement, filled the house, climbed through the pipes and vents and gaps. Outside, the night held its breath. The lights on Langley Street blinked once, and then they never blinked again. Samuel awoke on the basement floor, his body contorted in a shape that didn't feel entirely his. The concrete beneath him pulsed faintly, like the thrum of a heart buried under skin. His breath came in short, staggered pulls, and his vision blurred at the edges, as if the air itself was too thick to inhale fully. He tried to rise, but his limbs didn't obey. They twitched, jerked. His fingers curled and uncurled on their own. A low buzzing filled his ears, and underneath it, something slower, rhythmic, wet, a heartbeat. Not his, not human. He lifted his head. The basement was no longer the basement. The walls had shifted again. They were smooth, almost organic, with a sheen that reflected his trembling flashlight in sickly patches. The wooden stairs behind him had vanished, replaced by a fleshy ramp lined with subtle ridges like a tongue laid flat. The corners of the room curved upward into soft, breathing folds. Moisture dripped from above in slow, echoing plinks, the sound thick as syrup. There was no door, no way back. And in front of him, the eye, still open, still watching, but now it had grown. It filled the far wall entirely, an orb the size of a man, rimmed with blood-swollen veins. Its surface twitched, tracking him. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. He could feel it looking deeper than flesh, not just seeing him, reading him. The whispering returned, not loud, not angry, almost gentle. You built the hole. You invited us. Samuel crawled back, palms sliding in something thick and warm. I didn't know, he rasped. The eye blinked. Once. A terrible sound followed. The crunch of wet gravel. The rip of something tearing slowly. A shape began to rise from the floor, unfolding like muscle peeled from bone. It had limbs but too many, a torso but stretched and sunken. Its head was malformed, split down the middle and lined with ridges like the folds of a brain. And embedded across its body, eyes, so many eyes, every inch of it stared. You broke the seal, the thing said. But it didn't speak through a mouth. Its voice came from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from within Samuel's skull. You opened the path. Samuel shook his head, tears streaking down his dirt-smudged cheeks. I was just doing my job. I was fixing a wall. The creature stepped forward. Each movement made a slurping sound, like feet pulling free from wet sand. The wall was not broken, it replied. It was a prison. We were kept, watched. Samuel looked up through blurred vision. Watched by who? The creature tilted what passed for its head. The ones who came before, the blind who chose silence. They walled us in, but they left their eyes behind to watch us rot. And then Samuel understood. The eyes in the wall weren't them. They were guards. Each set of eyes belonged to a person who had come before him. Not victims, sentinels, sworn to never blink, trapped in mortar, buried in plaster, left to stare for eternity, so that the thing behind the wall could never leave. And he had freed it. His hammer had shattered more than plaster. It had broken an oath carved into bone and silence. Samuel collapsed against the slick floor, breath rattling. Then kill me! The thing paused. It crouched low, and all of its eyes blinked at once. We don't want to kill you. A pause. We want you to see. It lunged, its hand, if it could be called that, pressed to his face. Fingers of stretched skin and bone curled over his cheeks, forcing his eyes open. He screamed, kicked, thrashed, but it didn't matter. The thing wasn't trying to hurt him. It was planting something. A heat surged behind his eyes, a crawling sensation, like ants burrowing into the sockets. And then darkness, followed by light, not external, internal. Samuel could see memories that weren't his, visions of ancient places buried in silence, temples with walls made of flesh, altars smeared in tar-black blood. He saw faces twisted in terror, mouths agape forever. He saw the house on Langley Street, but it was older, wood fresh, paint clean and still. The eye was in the wall. He saw himself, swinging the hammer, breaking the seal, inviting them in. The visions snapped away. Samuel gasped awake again, this time on the main floor. The living room was whole, the walls sealed, no crack. The eyes were gone. He stood slowly, unsteady. The light through the blinds was morning gray. Had it all been a dream? Then he saw the mirror. His reflection stared back, but his eyes were not his. They were wrong, too wide, too open, and they didn't blink, even when he did. The reflection wouldn't stop watching him. Samuel stood in front of the bathroom mirror, barely breathing, eyes fixed on his own face. The man in the glass stared back, but not quite right. His skin looked too pale, too thin, stretched taut across cheekbones that hadn't been that sharp just days ago. And the eyes, wide, bloodshot, glistening with a wetness that never dried. He blinked. The reflection did not. He leaned in, breathing fog onto the glass. The air tasted metallic, like rust or old pennies. Slowly, his trembling fingers reached for the mirror's surface. Just as he touched it, the reflection smiled. But Samuel hadn't moved. He stumbled back, heart hammering, bile rising. The small room spun around him in spirals of peeling paint and dripping faucets. He gripped the sink to keep from collapsing, the cold porcelain grounding him. Behind the walls, he heard them again, the whispers. They had grown bolder since the eye touched him, or opened something inside him. The voices no longer waited for silence. They filled every gap in his thoughts, every breath. When he turned on the water, they murmured from the pipes. When the wind rattled the windows, they rode the breeze in soft, slithering tongues. Deeper, we see now, we speak through you. He hadn't gone back to the basement. He wouldn't, but the house didn't need him to descend anymore. It was rising. That evening, as the last light vanished behind the skeletal trees of Langley Street, Samuel sat on the floor of the living room with a notebook in his lap. He didn't remember opening it, didn't remember holding a pen, but the pages were filled. Lines and lines of words, none in his handwriting. Strange symbols, spirals, eyes drawn over and over in black ink. Some with eyelids sewn shut, others wide and weeping. And in the margins, repeated dozens of times, "The wall is not a boundary, it is a mouth." He threw the notebook across the room. It struck the wall and burst open, pages fluttering like dead leaves. Then the whispers began to chant, a low, rhythmic murmuring. It came from inside the walls, from the cracks, from behind the mirror. Samuel pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound didn't stop. It echoed from within. He screamed, ragged, desperate, but the sound of his own voice only made the chant grow louder. And then, silence, absolute, choking. He opened his eyes. A single crack now ran from the ceiling to the floor. Not jagged like before, clean, intentional. The plaster trembled and whispered, "Come closer." He didn't want to, but his legs moved anyway. His feet dragged against the floor as if pulled by invisible strings, by will not his own. He stood before the crack, heart pounding so loudly he thought the house might hear it. He placed his hand on the wall. It pulsed beneath his skin, and then it opened. Not wide, not violently, just enough for the voice to pour through. Your eyes were never meant to close. Something cold brushed his cheek. He turned, slowly, stiffly. The room behind him was no longer empty. Shapes stood in the corners, motionless, silent, figures with hollow faces and missing mouths. But each one had eyes, many eyes. Where noses should be, on their chests, palms, spines. They stared at him with hunger, not for flesh, but for purpose. "You will be the next watcher," the voice said. Samuel shook his head, stepping back. "No, I'm not. I didn't mean to let you out." "You didn't," the voice answered. "You let us in." The figures moved, slow, deliberate. One stepped forward, its face a mask of tight, translucent skin with a single blinking eye where its mouth should have been. It reached out, touching Samuel's shoulder. That saw every crack, every corridor hidden behind the house's bones. He saw others like him, in other places, kneeling in dark corners, eyes wide, mouths stitched, listening. He saw the truth. The walls of the world were not meant to protect. They were cages, and something had always been behind them, whispering to anyone foolish enough to press their ear too close. When he woke, it was morning. The notebook lay beside him, open to a blank page. His reflection in the window blinked once, and this time he didn't. From within the walls, the whispering continued, but now it spoke in his voice. And far away, across Langley Street, a child walking to school paused beside the old house. She turned to look at it, and deep in the plaster, something stared back. The house was no longer a place. It was a presence, a breath that filled the space between seconds, a skin stretched tight over a thing still waking. Langley Street had not noticed, or maybe it had, and simply pretended not to. Samuel walked through the rooms like a man in water, slow, weightless. The walls flexed gently as he passed, as if they recognized him now, accepted him, claimed him. He could hear them even when he wasn't listening. The whispers had changed. They no longer taunted, they instructed. Your hands are tools. Your voice is the key. You are mortar now. He hadn't left the house in days or weeks. Time no longer ticked in ways he could understand. The clocks had stopped anyway, their hands twisted backward as though trying to erase what had come before. He ate only when the house allowed it. He slept when the walls sang lullabies in dozens of hushed voices. And always, the eyes watched. They were everywhere now, embedded in the corners of ceilings, lining the edges of floorboards, staring from the backs of cupboards and the surfaces of mirrors. None of them blinked. They never needed to. He no longer questioned their presence. He feared the moments they weren't there. It was early evening, if such a thing existed anymore. When the house asked something new of him, it began with the sound, a low grinding behind the dining room wall, like stone shifting over bone. Then came the hum, a slow, wet vibration, rising from beneath the floor. Samuel knelt, placing both palms against the rotted wood. His breath slowed, his mind emptied, and then the voice spoke. Not as whisper, not as echo. It spoke through him. We must feed. He stood, moved without thinking. The basement door creaked open before he reached it. The steps no longer groaned beneath his weight. They welcomed it. The basement had changed again. No longer walls and shelves and water-stained concrete. Now it was raw flesh, a chamber of pulsing tissue, lit from within by veins that throbbed with pale green light. In the center of the room was a hole, round, deep, lined with muscle, breathing. Samuel approached, heart thudding against his ribs. He knew what it was. A mouth, a birth canal, a grave. He dropped to his knees before it, and the walls began to weep. Thick black fluid oozed from the cracks, dripping down in slow streams. It pooled around his feet, warm and humming. The air smelled of rust, milk, and rot. He dipped his fingers into the black. It burned, but the pain was right, necessary, transformative. With shaking hands, he painted the sigil across his chest, one of the many the house had drawn through him in the notebook. Symbols meant for calling, for binding, for remembering. The hole responded. It opened wider, revealing teeth embedded in the sides, jagged and bone white. Between them, something moved, slithering, coiling. A shape rose slowly from the pit. It had no face, just eyes. A dozen, 100, lining its skin like scales. It looked at Samuel. And he understood what it wanted. "I'll build it," he said aloud. The thing blinked, once, all eyes in perfect, unnatural unison. Mortar is memory, blood is bond, flesh is foundation. Samuel turned. The house began to reshape itself around him. The walls pulsed with new breath. Doorways sealed behind him as he walked. Hallways stretching impossibly long, then snapping short again. Rooms vanished. Others appeared. He could no longer find the front door. He didn't need to. There was no outside anymore. Only inside, only within. He found himself back in the living room. The wallpaper had peeled entirely now. Beneath it was raw material, something wet and veined. And within it, fragments of faces, mouths, noses, eyes. He picked up his tools, but not the ones he brought. The house had given him new ones. Instruments shaped from bone and metal. Tools made to build not with wood or stone, but with bodies. He opened a wall and reached into it. His hands found something soft, warm. He pulled. It screamed. The scream was short. Then it gurgled. Then it was silent. He pressed the thing against the exposed wall, and it sank into the flesh like wet clay. The house shuddered in pleasure. The eyes blinked in approval. Build us stronger. Build us deeper. He worked until his hands bled. Then he kept working. Time folded in on itself. Minutes passed like days, or days like seconds. The walls grew thicker. The house grew alive. Each new addition whispered its gratitude in his ear, in its own gurgled voice. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they wept. He used them anyway. And when he rested, he dreamt of walls without end, cities built of screaming stone, towers that blinked into the sky. He wasn't a builder anymore. He was a rememberer. Each brick laid was a name, each wall a story, and Samuel had thousands still to tell. But first, he would need more eyes. The windows no longer showed the outside. Where once there had been streets and sky and a fading line of trees, now there was only skin. Pale, pulsing, slick with moisture. Veins ran along the surface like roots twisting through wet earth. When Samuel pressed his face against the glass, he could hear it. A heartbeat. Slow. Heavy. Not his. The house was sealed. The doors had vanished days ago, replaced by blank walls that bled if scratched too hard. The stairs no longer led anywhere but down, down into places that shifted and reshaped like muscle under tension. Even the ceiling breathed. He hadn't seen the sun in what felt like years. But Samuel no longer counted time the way he used to. Clocks had stopped mattering once the voices began to speak in rhythm. They pulsed like drums from the walls, guiding his movements, dictating when to eat, when to sleep, when to work. He obeyed. He had long since stopped asking why. The house fed him now, not with food, with memory. Sometimes it dripped from the ceiling in warm, viscous streams that smelled like burnt sugar. Other times it emerged from behind the walls, carried on slick limbs that trembled with effort. The memories weren't his. They belonged to others, men and women, children, the ones who came before. He saw their lives flicker in the walls like static, saw them hammering, sawing, painting, then screaming, then silent. All of them had been builders once. All of them had fed the walls. Now they were part of the house, etched into the floorboards, pressed into the mortar, watching, always watching. That day, if it could be called a day, Samuel stood at the center of the living room, or what used to be the living room. The floor had become slick and uneven, and the wallpaper had long sloughed off like old skin. The fireplace had stretched itself into a yawning maw that exhaled heat with every breath. In his hand, he held a chisel made of bone. Its edge was sharp enough to cut through the veins embedded in the walls. The house had given it to him, but he hadn't used it yet. Because today, something was different. The whispers had stopped, not completely, but enough that he noticed the absence. A silence now filled the house, a waiting, a holding of breath. He moved through the halls. Doors opened where there were none. The hallway, stretched longer than it ever had before. Floor rising and falling like lungs beneath his feet. At the end, he found a door. Not flesh, not bone, wood, old, weathered, painted white and flaking. A door like the one he'd first entered. It should not be here. His hand hovered above the knob. Then a whisper returned. Only one word, leave. He gripped the handle, turned. It clicked. Samuel hesitated, breath caught in his throat. He opened it. Sunlight spilled through the crack. Real light, blinding, sharp, cold. The air on the other side didn't pulse. It didn't breathe. It didn't watch. He stepped through. For a moment, he thought he had escaped. The door shut behind him with a gentle click. He stood in the middle of Langley Street. It was morning. Birds chirped. Wind rustled leaves. A woman jogged past with headphones in, smiling as she passed. He blinked against the brightness. It hurt. He turned back to look at the house. It stood as it always had, weathered, quiet, shutters drawn, the cracks gone, the windows empty. He stepped toward it, but his foot hit something. A mirror, small, handheld, lying in the gutter. He picked it up, looked into it, and the world froze. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed, too wide, and it smiled. His mouth did not move. Behind the eyes, something blinked. The whisper returned. You never left. He dropped the mirror. But the world around him was already changing. The sky rippled. The sun grew too large. The birdsong reversed. People on the street froze mid-step, then turned to face him in perfect unison. Each of their eyes were his. They didn't blink. The house behind him groaned, and the ground split beneath his feet. The street peeled away like paper soaked in blood, and Samuel fell. Not down, back in. Back through the skin of the world, back into the house, back into the breath. The door reappeared behind him, sealed shut. He didn't try to open it. He no longer had hands, only eyes, so many eyes, watching, waiting, seeing. It was night inside the house, but not the night that came from the absence of light. This was something deeper, denser, a darkness that clung to the walls like rot to bone. A darkness with weight, with memory. Samuel no longer walked. He drifted. His body was somewhere far behind him now, buried in the wall perhaps, layered beneath 100 others. But his awareness moved freely, through the veins of the house, through the pulsing cavities and the soft folds of shifting rooms. He was part of it now, not prisoner, not victim, witness. The house had grown. It was no longer just the decaying structure on Langley Street. It had roots now, invisible to the world, threaded into the foundations of nearby homes, winding through the dirt like nerves searching for new hosts. It fed slowly, carefully. It whispered through cracked tiles and flickering light bulbs, through cold spots and unseen corners. The people who lived nearby had started to complain of headaches, strange dreams, a sense of being watched. They weren't wrong. They were being chosen. Samuel saw them. From behind the walls. From under the floor. from within the mirrors, every time one of them lingered too long at the edge of thought, stared too long into the shadows of their own homes. Samuel would blink, and so would the walls. He watched the boy in the house next door draw eyes in his notebook, hundreds of them. Watched his mother weep over the sound of whispering faucets. Watched the old man across the street stare into the storm drain and tremble as something whispered his name back. The house was spreading, and Samuel guided it. One whisper at a time, one breath, one crack. But tonight, something else came. A knock, a sound that did not belong. It echoed through the halls, loud, sharp, defiant. The house reacted like a body struck, walls stiffening, breath catching, the lights flickering in a confused pattern. Another knock, then a voice. Samuel Greaves? It was female, human, unaware. The house wanted to devour her. But Samuel hesitated. He moved toward the source, passing through the walls like breath through teeth, until he reached the front door. She stood on the porch, a woman in her early 30s, wind-chapped skin, clipboard in hand. Her name badge read, Elena Rourke, City Planning. She knocked again, hesitant now. We received a report about hazardous structural collapse. She trailed off, peering at the warped windows. The house hissed beneath her feet. Samuel looked at her through the peephole, not with fear, not with hunger, but with recognition. She had the same eyes. He didn't mean shape or color. He meant weight. She felt it too, the watching, the call. He opened the door. Elena flinched. Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure anyone was. She stopped. Samuel's eyes met hers. They were wide, still, reflective like mirrors. She blinked, and for just a moment, he saw her not as a stranger, but as another witness. Something passed between them, an understanding older than speech. Her lips parted. What is this place? Samuel smiled gently, not cruelly, not kindly, just knowingly. It sees. Behind him, the hallway walls began to pulse. Elena stepped back, but did not flee. Something was waking inside her too, something that remembered. Samuel stepped aside. Come in, he said. She didn't move. The walls whispered around them. I see you, Elena said quietly. Samuel nodded, and the house exhaled. For the first time in decades, it sounded relieved. Elena crossed the threshold, and as the door shut softly behind her, all the eyes in the house blinked at once, and then stayed open forever.